This is the International Anthony Burgess Foundation podcast. In this episode, we're talking the art of translation with Anthony Burgess's current German translator, Ludger Tolksdorf. Translation is a little discussed form of literary creation and adaptation, and was an extremely important part of Burgess's life and work. Not only is Burgess's work translated into many languages, but he also translated poems, novels and plays into English, starting in 1962 with Michel de Saint-Pierre's New Aristocrats and Jean Pellegri's The Olive Trees of Justice. These were both translated in collaboration with his first wife, Lynn. In 1965 he translated The Man Who Robbed Poor Boxes by Jean Servan. A translation of Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand followed, and his translations of the sonnets of the Roman poet Giuseppe Giacchino Belli appeared in the second part of his novel Abba Abba. The archive at the Burgess Foundation also has papers and books related to the work of Burgess's second wife, Liana, who worked as Thomas Pynchon's Italian translator, and went on to translate many of Burgess's books. To talk about his own experience of translating Burgess, Ludger Tolksdorf joined us from Bonn, where he works as an editor and translator. He began his career by translating several of Vladimir Nabokov's books, including Letters to Vera and the original of Laura. In 2018, he published the first volume of Burgess's Malayan Trilogy, Jetzt, Tiger. His latest publication as editor is Sommerleithe by Klaus Weise. It's published by Elsinor and has been selected for the 2021 long list of the best books by independent German-language publishing houses. Ludger is currently working on his translations of the second and third volumes of the Malayan Trilogy, titled Der Feind in der Decke and Die Betten im Orient. They will be published by Elsinor in 2022. More information on his work can be found on his website www.lt-tolksdorf.de. Now I'll hand over to the Burgess Foundation's Andrew Biswell, who talked to Ludger in July 2021.
Ludger, welcome to the Anthony Burgess Foundation podcast. It's a great pleasure that you're able to join us. First of all, tell us something about yourself. We're very interested to know your background, where you studied and how you began your career as a translator.
Thanks very much for your warm welcome. Well, I've got an MA from Bonn University in American Studies, Modern History and English. And after I took my degree, I decided to try to do a PhD on Martin Amis and memory. And in order to earn my keep, I worked at the Institute of Agricultural Engineering of Bonn University, and I did some administrative and translation work there. And after a while, it turned out that this PhD was not for me, or that it was too much strain earning my keep in one area and doing advanced studies in a different one. So I gave up on the PhD, and what I was left with was the translation part from my job at the agriculture department. So I worked as a freelance translator for a couple of years, doing mostly technical translations, until in 2008, I think, Nabokov's son decided that he wanted to publish his father's posthumous novel, The Original of Laura. And I had the cheek to write to the prospective translator and suggest that he let me look over his shoulder while he was doing the translation. And in the end, he made me co-translator of the book, and that's when I started a run of Nabokov translations. So that's how I started out.
Very interesting connections between Nabokov and Burgess, of course, which kind of leads me into my next question, which is about your first encounter with Anthony Burgess. I wonder when or how you first came across his writing.
If I remember rightly, I think I was Alex's age when I first read A Clockwork Orange. 14 or 15, but I was only 2 or 3 years into learning English at the time, so I didn't quite get what the book was about, or the Natsat was too much for me at that moment. So I think I returned to it later, 5 years later, when I was studying, and I really loved it then, and bought everything by Anthony Burgess that I could lay my hands on. I think Earthly Powers, One Hand Clapping, The Right to an Answer, Any Old Iron, Nothing Like the Sun, Piano Players, End of the World News, the Enderby novels, all that, the usual reading.
Sure. And the Malayan Trilogy, recently you've been working on the first German version of Burgess's Malayan Trilogy. Volume 1's already published. Parts 2 and 3 are under contract and forthcoming from Elsinor. And it's interesting for us to know, was that something you proposed? Did you find the translation, or did it find you?
No, it was something that I proposed, because it was a book that I really liked a lot, and that I thought might be worth putting into German, because it's difficult to understand for a non-native speaker of English, I think, because of the colonial setting and because of the colonial language in it, all this polyphony of colonial voices. Malays learning English at an English school, and speaking English with a bookish tone, with outdated idioms, or with their typical kinds of mistakes. That's something that's very difficult to follow for a German reading English. So I thought that that might be something worth putting into German and making accessible for Germans. Although that's one big part of the challenge of translating the book as well.
Well, I'm sure there are other challenges as well. There's a lot of Malay in the novel, as we know from Burgess's glossary that he published slightly later. Also elements of Chinese, Urdu, other languages. So faced with the challenge of making this intelligible to German readers, how do you go about that?
I think that was the least of the problems in that novel, because I just left those parts in. I didn't have to change them. I think what Anthony Burgess does in the Malayan Trilogy is similar to what he does with Natsat in Clockwork Orange. It's some kind of brainwashing process. You can pick up some Malay while reading the book, and I have a suspicion that he glued the glossary on afterwards at his publisher's request.
I think that's right. Yes,
and his intention was to make readers learn Malay by reading the book. So I think I was able to leave that alone, and I didn't want to put in footnotes on every single page, because I wanted to keep it in the spirit of Burgess, forcing you to learn while you're reading.
And you're right. Often the Malay words and so forth, the meaning is apparent from the context, the position within the sentence and so forth. And that is of a piece with the Clockwork Orange and other works. Burgess, I'm sure, would have agreed with your principle there, because when he was in discussion with his translators, he very much disliked the notes at the bottom of the page, or the translation notes. Translator's notes, which say play of words that is not translatable, something like that. Finding equivalents in the new language is really the way he preferred to do it. So tell us about your own writing process. How many drafts do you do? How do you go about? Presumably there's quite a gradual process, a number of different sweeps and different activities at each stage. Tell us something about that.
I think it depends a lot on what I'm working on. I think in the Malayan Trilogy, I did one run from beginning to finish, leaving out the poetry, and after that, I think in a second one, I returned to the poetry and concentrated on the natural flow of the German version. And I checked the character speech in the novel, because that, as I said, was one of the challenges, turning colonial English into some kind of German for which there is no equivalent. Germany never had that kind of colonies where people of a significant number learned German in German schools. And after that, I think in a third run through, I went through the whole text and checked it against the original again, because I never want to move away too much from the original. And after that, there was another final read through. So I think it's 4 or 5 workings, 4 or 5 drafts that I did, at least.
That's very impressive. I mean, it's also, for anyone who doesn't know it, I should say it's a very substantial work, the trilogy.
Yeah.
You've got something like 600 pages in the original English version, and I expect your translation is perhaps even longer than that.
Yeah, I think it's 10% longer than the original. That's the kind of extension you get when you translate into German.
Yes, and tell people why that is. I mean, that's always an interesting point, that the translation tends to be longer.
I don't quite know. I mean, German is quite famous for its long words, and I think the sentence structure is a bit more complicated. That's one of the main reasons, I think.
Now, Burgess's 3 Malayan books are obviously a series of comic novels, and I wonder, are there particular tests here for the translator? How do you approach the difficulty of translating things like jokes and puns and humour more generally?
Yeah, it's difficult to generalize, really, because every single problem requires an individual answer. Sometimes I usually translate very close to the text and move away from it when required, and that's jokes and puns are when I have to move away from the literal meaning of the original. Maybe I can give you one example. And Time for a Tiger, Nabi Adams's dog is called Cough, and there's a lot of or a few different jokes involved there, because the obvious one is that or the name stems from the previous owner, because the dog kept getting under his previous owner's feet, and he was told in impolite language to get lost. So and an additional aspect is that in the mid-50s, it was impossible in a novel to write fuck off. So that is also a wink to the reader from Burgess personally as the author, telling him, well, I can sneak it in anyway. So the difficulty was, how can I translate this? Obviously, the literal meaning of cough doesn't really play a great role, but I had to find an equivalent for fuck off or piss off. And I came up with a very, with what in hindsight seems very obvious, but something that Burgess's other translators didn't think of when encountering this for cough in the Enderby novels. And I said, I called the dog Iss dich, which in German means eat yourself, which is all, similarly empty of real meaning, similar to cough. And but you can tell that it's an abbreviation of verpiss dich, meaning piss off. So that was one of the solutions that I had to find. It's terribly boring in hearing it explained.
No, it's fascinating for us completely. And there are other kinds of riddles, I suppose, in the text. You've got your quotations, your allusions, and I wondered how much of that material, especially if Burgess is referencing something like Tennyson, I don't know how well he's known to German readers. How much of that material is it possible, do you think, to communicate in your translation?
I think a lot of that has to get lost. I mean, the the fact that he is referencing Tennyson or Hopkins, that will be something that gets lost on the reader. But those passages always stick out in the normal prose. For example, there's a scene where Lieutenant Flaherty is hung over, and in A Time for a Tiger it says,
At that moment a groan of penitence came from an upper room. It was Flaherty, ill. God's most deep decree bitter would have him taste.
That sticks out, and you immediately notice that there's something else going on. This is not Burgess. And I decided that there are translations of this poem in German, but they didn't really seem appropriate. They didn't seem strange enough. So I translated this line myself and made sure that it does sound strange in German, that even German readers notice that this comes from somewhere else, even if they don't know that it's from Hopkins. And I still, as I said before, I didn't want to put in footnotes. I might one day publish a list of notes on the publisher's website, but I think it shouldn't be part of the book. It's not in the spirit of Burgess. You have to be willing to learn and look up.
Ludger, you very kindly agreed to read us some passages from your translation of Time for a Tiger. In this scene from Time for a Tiger, Fenella Crabbe reads The Wasteland to Nabi Adams and Aladad Khan.
Was aber war Nabi Adams? Sie konnte nicht glauben, dass mit Vornamen wirklich Abel hieß. Und Nabi Adams Herkunft. Hatte tatsächlich eine indische Mutter und einen eurasischen Vater? In seinen Erzählungen erschienen diese Figuren als derbe Dorfbewohner aus Northamptonshire. Sein Vater war Küster, seine Mutter hatte ein Händchen fürs Backen und für das Räuchern von Schinken. Tief im Innersten von Nabi Adams lag ein nie zu lösendes Rätsel. Ich bin kein Freund von der Kirche, Mrs. Crabbe, aber für eine schöne Lethargie habe ich immer was übrig. Eine schöne Lethargie? Fenella Crabbe stellte allerlei eigentümliche Versuche mit Nabi Adams an. Sie spielte ihm auf dem Grammophon Bach vor und er sagte, das ist richtig clever, Mrs. Crabbe, da kann man 5 Melodien gleichzeitig hören. Sie las ihm und Aladad Khan Das wüste Land von Mr. Elliot vollständig vor und Nabi Adams sagte, beim Kartenspiel hat er sich vertan, Mrs. Crabbe. Es gibt im Tarot keine Karte, die der Mann mit den 3 Stäben heißt. Diese Karte, die er meint, ist eine normale 3, so wie die Kreuz 3. Und als sie am düsteren, donnersprechenden Schluss des Gedichts angelangt waren, hatte Aladad Khan ernst genickt. Datta, Dayadvam, Damyata, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Er sagt, den Teil versteht er, Mrs. Crabbe. Er sagt, das ist es, was der Donner sagt.
And here's the English version.
But what was Nabi Adams? She could not believe that his first name was really Abel. And the genesis of Nabi Adams? Did he really have an Indian mother or a Eurasian father? These characters emerged in his stories as salty Northamptonshire rurals. His father had been a sexton, his mother a good hand with pastry and curing a ham. At the core of Nabi Adams lay a mystery never to be solved.
I'm not one for the church, Mrs. Crabbe, but I do like a good hymn.
A good?
Hymn.
Fenella Crabbe submitted Nabi Adams to all kinds of curious experiments. She played Bach to him on the gramophone, and he said,
That's very clever, Mrs. Crabbe. You can hear 5 different tunes going on at the same time.
She read to him and Aladad Khan the whole of Mr. Eliot's The Wasteland, and Nabi Adams said,
He's got that wrong about the pack of cards, Mrs. Crabbe. There ain't no card called the Man with 3 Staves. That card what he means is just an ordinary 3, like as it may be the 3 of clubs.
And when they came to the dark, thunder-speaking finale of the poem, Aladad Khan had nodded gravely. Datta, Dayadvam, Damyata, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
He says he understands that bit, Mrs. Crabbe. He says that's what the thunder says.
Now, I also wonder what kind of reference books you use when you're working. And I ask this because I once visited Burgess's French translator, Georges Belmont, in his study. And there on his desk was an enormous dictionary of synonyms,
Yeah.
which I guess was essential to his practice. But there must be other things as well, especially for writers like Nabokov and Burgess, dictionaries of slang and so forth. Tell us about that.
I've got a couple of dictionaries of slang, but or dictionaries in general, but mostly I use online sources. Google is very effective. In the case of the Malayan Trilogy, I use Liana Burgess's Italian version for passages that are somehow unclear to me, because I assume that she worked with her husband and was able to ask him what he meant in a certain passage. And well, I use online dictionaries mostly. The OED, Green's slang dictionary is very good.
Liana, you're right, did work very closely with Burgess on her translations. And in particular, when she was translating The End of the World News into Italian, though they were living in the same house, she would type up a list of queries as if sending it in the post.
Yeah.
And I think probably put it under the closed door of his study. And he would then go through her typewritten list and write the answer to her queries by hand. And then, as I imagine it, go back to her study and put it under the door so as not to disturb her. And they did work, I'm sure, very closely. Interesting to know that you're referring to this Italian version. That's, I'm sure a very valuable source of information and so forth. Now, my next question is really whether anything gets lost in translation. You've touched on this already. What happens if you can't find an exact equivalent for English idioms or old-fashioned bits of slang?
Yeah, it's difficult to say, really. It always requires an individual solution. For example, in The Enemy in the Blanket, one of Talbot's strange poems contains a slang expression. In this poem,
Cracks open the leaden corncrake sky with crass, angelic wails as round as cornfruit, sharp as crowfoot, clawfoot, rash, brash, loutish gouts of lime or vinegar strokes, till the crinkled fish start from their lace of bone.
And these vinegar strokes, according to Green's slang dictionary, means the final thrusts of sexual intercourse. And something that I had to look up because it sounded strange to me. And but the difficulty in this context was, is Talbot even aware of using this or aware of the meaning of this phrase? Or is any of the characters in the scene aware of the meaning of this phrase? So when translating this, I decided not to go for a similar idiom or a similar slang expression in German, but to give the German text sexual connotations, or to amplify the sexual connotations in the poem to a degree that I could still say, well, I didn't notice. This has nothing to do with me as a translator. I wasn't aware of this being in the text.
I wanted to ask a bit more about Burgess. As we know, Burgess and both of his wives, Lynn and Liana, they were all very heavily involved in translation. If you think about the activity in their various houses, you've got French books coming into English, English books going into Italian. He is working with other people to translate Belly from Roman dialect into Lancashire dialect. He's also inventing new languages, as we know, for A Clockwork Orange and the film Quest for Fire. And then towards the end of his life, he was reworking Blooms of Dublin with Liana as an Italian musical. Now, there is a question here, which is what do you make of Burgess as a literary translator?
I think I really like his sonnet translations of Belly, because they I can't read the original, but they seem very engaging and a very funny take on the originals. And I think the the quality of the sonnets lies in the fact that he sticks very closely to the rules of the sonnet and also delivers some kind of joke. I don't know how close the joke is to the joke in the belly poems, but as texts they seem very successful, is all I can say. And of course he had to move away from the literal meaning of the original, as Paul Howard shows in his edition of Abba Abba.
I wonder, do you think, is it possible to work out, did Burgess have a theory of translation, or do you have one?
I think Burgess could have come up with one at the flick of a switch, and with a new one 2 weeks later. I I think in one of his texts he says that translation is always transformation. I would say that it's approximation, but I think the context in which he said that it was transformation was translation between different cultures. I think he was talking about translation from Chinese into English, and from Malay into English, whereas my point of reference is always English into German, and we're culturally very similar. So there's not that wide a gap to be bridged by translation. So it's not, we have a shared cultural frame of reference. So the challenge is not quite as big or quite the same as in translation between cultures. So it's therefore, I think that when I translate, it's more a challenge of approximation rather than transformation. In most cases, approximation is enough, and in exceptional cases, as we discussed, you have to find different solutions.
Now, I have a very broad question arising out of Burgess's work and your own work. How far do you think of him as a British writer or a European writer?
I think it's difficult to assign geographical names here. I think his point of departure is always Britain and British culture, but he's not in any way parochial. So and not parochial in terms of reference to Britain, but not Eurocentric either. I think his work on language, for example, shows his interest in the entire world, and I think whatever he writes about, he takes the entire world into consideration. So in that respect, I think he's a world writer. But on the other hand, I think in one of his essays he said that he wanted to be the kind of author that foreigners learn English for, so that they can read his books in English. And that's, in that way, he would be an English writer, primarily.
Yeah, there's a lot there, isn't there, to think about. And certainly after he left England in 1968, I think he thought of himself much more as an international person of letters, possibly a European writer, maybe much more outward looking, though in a sense he'd always been leaving England. I mean, when he went to Gibraltar, when he went to Malaya, when he went to Russia. So it's very difficult to separate his life into periods of, sort of English activity or other kinds of activity. And I suppose learning languages at school, growing up with the Latin Mass and so forth, there were always other languages, other influences at work in his life. Here's an extract from Time for a Tiger. This is one of the drinking scenes where Victor and Fenella Crabbe are enjoying a drink with Nabi Adams and Aladad Khan.
Etwas Gin, Nabi. Nicht auch, sagte Nabi Adams. Bitte kein Wasser. Ich schmecke ihn gern pur. Ohne das Gesicht zu verziehen, trank er einen prallen Schluck von dem reinen Schnaps. Schüchtern ließ Aladad Khan sich das Gleiche geben und brach in einen Hustenanfall aus. Darin liegt sein verdammtes Problem, sagte Nabi Adams. Glaubt, er kann trinken, aber er kann es gar nicht. Los, setzte er hinzu. Immer raus damit, wenn es keine Miete zahlt. Es war bedauerlich, dass sie ausgerechnet jetzt hereinkam. Er, Aladdin Khan, vom Husten rot angelaufen unter seinem Brauen, die Augen voller Tränen, Feuer in der Kehle. Er hatte vorgehabt, ruhig und zuvorkommend zu sein und in sorgfältigem Englisch zu sagen, »Guten Abend, Mem Saab.« »Danke, Mem Saab.« Sie trat ein, anmutig in dünnem, blumigem Stoff, freundlich und besorgt. »Lassen Sie sich von dem nicht stören, Mrs. Crabbe«, sagte Nabi Adams und blieb unbewegt sitzen. »Der Künstler da hustet sich nur die Seele aus dem Leib.« Fenella vernahm es mit Freuden. Ein Künstler, der sich die Seele heraushustete. Das ließ sich auf jeden der schwindsüchtigen Poeten beziehen. Irgendwann müsste sie es verwenden.
And here's the same scene in English.
Have some gin, Nabby?
No thanks, said Nabi Adams. No water. I like to taste it as it is.
He drank with no grimace a bulging mouthful of the raw spirit. Aladdin Khan accepted shyly the same and burst into a shock of coughing.
That's his bloody trouble, said Nabi Adams evenly. Thinks he can drink, and he can't. Go on, he added. Get it up, even though it's only a bucketful.
It was unfortunate that she should enter just then. He, Aladdin Khan, red with coughing under his brown, eyes full of tears, fire in his gullet. He had meant to be calm, gentlemanly, saying in careful English, "Good evening, Mem Sahib. Thank you, Mem Sahib." She entered, graceful in thin flowery stuff, gracious and solicitous.
Don't mind about him, Mrs. Crabbe, said Nabi Adams, remaining calmly seated. He's only coughing his heart up.
Fenella heard this with appreciation. Coughing his heart up. That could apply to any of the tubercular poets. She must use it sometime.
Now, I wanted to ask about the role of the literary translator, because it's very interesting for me and for us to find out whether you think of yourself as a kind of invisible presence or as a creative artist who is maybe even the joint author of the text. What conclusions do you arrive at about that?
I see myself as ideally invisible. I don't want to be visible to the reader. It has to feel like a natural read. I have immense respect for people who are able to write entire books, and I wouldn't be able to do it. So I have respect for the original author, and I think the main achievement is the writing of the original book. It's thinking it up, and the words are only a trace of what has gone into the book, and being able to reproduce that in a different language is by no way comparable to the original work, to the original effort of writing the book. So it's more of a parrot, really. A lucky parrot.
Now, tell us about the translations you've been working on, the Burgess books. Obviously, volumes 2 and 3 of the trilogy are they're under contract. When will they be out?
I hope they will be out next year. Volume 2 has been. I've finished translating that, and I'm working on volume 3 now.
Well, we'll look forward to that very much. And for your own part, do you have ambitions to translate other Burgess novels, or are you hoping to work on different projects?
I mean, there are a lot of other books by Burgess that I would love to translate. I would really like Burgess to take off in German, become a success, and it's a question of really finding a publisher willing to take the risk time and again, and to invest money. That so I hope that soon there will be good sales for Anthony Burgess in German.
Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to that very much. And thank you, Ludger, for opening the door on your workshop and telling us about the nuts and bolts of translation.
It's been a
pleasure. Been really interesting. A pleasure to have you.
Thank you for your interest. Thanks.
You have been listening to the International Anthony Burgess Foundation podcast. Ludger Tolksdorf's final 2 volumes of the Malayan Trilogy will be published in 2022. To find out more about his work, visit www.lt-tolksdorf.de. For more information about Anthony Burgess, visit our website www.anthonyburgess.org. You can also connect with us on Twitter @AnthonyBurgess. If you have enjoyed this podcast, remember to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.